Thank you very much. Is this too loud? Or? Anyway, it's very nice to be here. This book was written in 1998, and this is actually the first time I've ever given a talk about it. It's amazing. It indicates how this book has not been well received, you might say, in the academic world. It's been sort of ignored. It hasn't been refuted, but it has been ignored. So what I want to do is to talk about how I conceptualize the strategy, as it were, of this book. And because the first problem that you have in dealing with a project like this is the obvious point that Jews are not monolithic. There are a lot of Jews that have very different opinions about things. Certainly not all Jews are psychoanalysts, or not all Jews are in the Frankfurt School. And so that's the first kind of objection that I get. So the technique here, the argument basically is to find intellectual movements that are dominated by Jews, and you have to, of course, dominate. You have to document that, with no indication that all Jews are involved in these movements. There's no indication that it could be conservative or liberal or radical. You're not going to make any restrictions on what kinds of movements there are. And you have to then determine whether these Jewish participants, that they have to identify as Jews. I mean, they can't be someone who's like totally assimilated, has become a Protestant, doesn't care about Judaism anymore. So they have to be strongly identified as Jews, and they have to think of their involvement in this movement as advancing Jewish interests. That is to say, you have to document that the people involved take the Judaism very seriously, and that they see their involvement in these movements as advancing specific interests, such as ending anti-Semitism. In fact, that's the most common interest, I think, that we see in all these Jewish intellectual movements, is the urge to destroy, to end anti-Semitism as a phenomenon in Western societies. And then what you have to do, which is also not very easy, is to try to see how influential these movements were. I mean, it's not impossible to do that. I mean, there's an awful lot written, say, on the influence of psychoanalysis and the influence of the Frankfurt School and so on. So it's not rocket science. You can do this kind of stuff. And the point is that how influential this movement is totally independent of what percentage of the Jewish population is involved in these movements. And quite often, like with psychoanalysis or something like that, I'm sure there are quite a few Jews who had never heard of psychoanalysis or the Frankfurt School. This is a very academic kind of thing. You're going to find huge numbers of Jews who have not ever heard of this. They're not involved. They don't know about it. Can you still say it is a Jewish intellectual movement? My argument is yes, you can. The question is it influential? Are the people who are doing this, do they identify strongly as Jews? Do they see their involvement in this as advancing Jewish interests? And then, of course, you have to deal with the fact that there are non-Jews that are involved in these movements. All of these movements have had non-Jews, oftentimes in very prominent positions. Oftentimes, these non-Jews have appeared as spokesmen for these movements. It's very common in psychoanalysis. Ernest Jones, for example, became probably one of the most well-known psychoanalysts, and it wasn't really because of his accomplishments so much, but he was sort of a spokesman. He was not a Jew, but he was sort of the face, or a face of psychoanalysis. And then you also want to see how people responded to these movements. Were these movements a source of anti-Semitism? And of course, it was the case. The Frankfurt School was shut down by the National Socialists in Germany. Psychoanalysis similarly got a lot of hostility from non-Jews in the 1920s and 1930s. Certainly, there's a big involvement on the left by Jews, and that was also a source of anti-Semitism. But anyway, all those things have to be documented. You have to, really do quite a bit of research to nail these things down. One good example is to understand the strategy is thinking about Zionism. Zionism, there's no question that Zionism is a Jewish movement. It's all about, establishing a homeland in Israel and so on. But the fact is, most Jews were not Zionists, prior to about 1948 when Israel was established. So just the fact that most Jews were not Zionists doesn't mean that Zionism was not an intellectual movement, a Jewish movement. It always was a Jewish intellectual movement, the Jewish political movement. And it's interesting that if you look at the response to the American Jewish Committee in the 1930s and the 1940s to the fact that there were so many Jews and radicals in these radical leftist movements, communism and so on, the point that they always made was that most Jews are not radicals. But again, during the same period, they were very concerned to try to actually go into the Jewish community and convince Jews not to be radicals. Why? Because they knew that if in fact communism or radicalism was a Jewish movement, in the sense that most of them were Jews, it was all these Jewish networks and so on, that really was the deciding factor. That's what made it a Jewish movement. And so the point is that the American Jewish Committee was implicitly recognizing that statements that only a minority of Jews are radical may have been true, but were not relevant to these 3 points. Jewish identification is compatible with or facilitates involvement in radicalism. Jews constitute a predominant or necessary element in radical political movements, or the influences on non-Jewish society resulting from Jewish predominance in these movements may be conceptualized as a consequence of Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. Again, the point is the people involved are strongly identified as Jews, and they see this as advancing specific Jewish interests. So on the question of non-Jews who participated in this, quite often it's just plain old self-interest. I mean, obviously, it's been very common for African American black intellectuals to sign on to a lot of these fairly radical environmentalist movements. There's no such thing as IQ, or it's all culture. There are no influences of the genes, and so on. And that's obviously in their interest. They don't want to see lack of accomplishment as a result of genetic influences. They want to see it as a result of a racist white society. So it fits with their own political agenda. So it's quite often that you have these ethnic minority activists signing on to these intellectual movements that propose environmentalist explanations for everything, where genes are completely out of the picture, that kind of thing. And also, it's a very good path to having a fine career, right? That's one of the saddest parts when these various movements become dominant. It's very easy to get it's much easier, shall we say, to get have a career in the media or at the high level in the academic world, because you're on the right page with these guys. Especially with one of the places I've noticed that is especially with the neocons. This is a movement in American politics, very pro-Israel. In fact, their whole agenda really is pro-Israel. But it's very easy if you are a neocon to get a job on Fox News, because Fox News is entirely dominated by these people. And so if you're not a Jew and you have ideas that are very compatible with theirs, if you go along with it, you can have a very good career. Same with think tanks. A lot of think tanks in Washington, very lucrative positions, and they're spotting these kinds of things. So people want to have a good career. That's certainly a good way to go. And I think that quite a few of these people do believe it. I mean, it's sincere to say here. They've been indoctrinated. I mean, quite often in our society now, I'm sure it's true in Europe, from the very earliest days in school, kindergarten, first grade, we are constantly inundated with these ideas. So it's not surprising that by the time people get out of college and so on, that they're going to be spouting these ideas. They're going to actually believe that there's no such thing as race, that IQ is just a racist concept, that the genes have no influence, all cultures are equal. Those kinds of things are absolutely commonly taught now in school. So it's not surprising that some of these people probably really believe what they are doing. But anyway, the point is there are several very important reasons why non-Jews are going to be attracted to these movements. And there are also some movements that I think were in a sense Jewish or strong Jewish involvement, but they were not really Jewish intellectual movements as I have defined the term. That is something like theoretical physics, where you have major involvement of people like Einstein and so on. But it's not really aimed at advancing Jewish interests, as far as I can see. In other words, whether or not the theory of relativity is correct is not really end anti-Semitism. It's fairly irrelevant to it. I mean, you can make some kind of long, convoluted argument, but I don't think that's really what's going on. And the fact is, Einstein was a strong Zionist. He was a very strong identified Jew and all that. He opposes assimilation. He says it's a contemptible form of mimicry and so on. He preferred other Jews. But that doesn't make this a Jewish intellectual movement, because it really had nothing to do with Jewish interests. So you have to nail down things like anti-Semitism, like exclusion from society, like the fact that Jewish holidays are not celebrated, or whatever it is that motivates people to participate in these movements. So, again, my book was originally published in 1998, but recently there's a paper came out in American Sociological Review, which actually the points that they make about successful intellectual movements are exactly what I was arguing in the Culture Critique. So I thought what I would do is divide out, is to structure this lecture in terms of what they are saying. This is Fossey and Gross, or Frickel and Gross. I think it's, I'm not sure that's right. Anyway, yeah, Frickel and Gross. So what they're saying is that all important intellectual movements had three ingredients. The first is people in high status positions having complaints against the current system. So having a complaint, and what complaint obviously has, throughout the Culture Critique, the main complaint is anti-Semitism. So the first thing I'll do today is talk about the complaints that Jewish intellectuals have had. The second point, also very strong point of the Culture Critique, is that these intellectual movements are cohesive and cooperative. That is, they are on page with each other. They cite each other, they promote each other's work, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of cooperation, ethnic networking, as we say. And this network has access to prestigious outlets. Our culture works in a top-down way. It's the top institutions. In America, you have institutions like Harvard, Yale, the Ivy League universities. You have prestigious media like the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, and so on. You have to get to the top level. It goes top down. It doesn't go from some small rural newspaper and go to the top. It always goes top down. And so the point is to show that these intellectual movements had access to the most prestigious media and academic institutions in the society.